Okay. Hello, everybody. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me to present. I'm very much looking forward to spending the next hour with you. I want to share my slides. Okay. And we are going to talk about heart rate variability, mindfulness, and compassion. I'd like to start with becoming aware of what connects those three concepts together, and that is self-regulation. Mindfulness, self-compassion, and heart rate variability are all at the core of our ability to self-regulate. That is our ability to respond to changes in our environment in healthy and helpful ways. And all three can be used interchangeably or simultaneously in order to help improve our ability to be healthy, to respond well to stress and challenges, to whatever might come our way. You've already heard several experts define the concepts of mindfulness and compassion, so I will not do that here, but I will talk about the concept of heart rate variability and then connect those with mindfulness and self-compassion. Heart rate variability refers to the change in time that passes from one heartbeat to the next. What you see on the screen in front of you is an electrocardiogram. Each R peak, indicated as R1, R2, R3, is a reflection of a heartbeat. It's the contraction of the left ventricle of the heart, contracting and sending oxygenated blood out to the body. So if you were to take your pulse on your wrist or on your neck, you would feel a thump, thump, thump. Each one of those thumps is a heartbeat. It's that contraction of the left ventricle of the heart sending blood out to the body that you see as R1, R2, R3 peaks on the slide. And if you were to count those thumps, you would probably count somewhere between 60 and 80 of them in a minute. That is your heart rate. But the time that passes from one heartbeat to the next is changing all the time. That is what we refer to as heart rate variability. Sometimes heartbeats come closer together and the heart rate is speeding up, as you see in intervals R4 to R5 and R5 to R6. And other times, heartbeats start coming further apart. The time from one heartbeat to the next becomes longer. The heart rate is slowing down, as you can see in intervals R1 to R2, R2 to R3, R3 to R4. Your heart rate is speeding up and slowing down at all times. If your heart were to beat with 882 millisecond intervals, your heart rate would be 68 beats per minute. If your heart were to beat with 674 millisecond intervals, your heart rate would be 89 beats per minute. That is your instantaneous heart rate. And that is the heart rate that is changing all the time, increasing and decreasing, accelerating and decelerating. Here we see another way of looking at your heart rate variability. On the top of the slide, you see the raw EKG with those R peaks clearly visible. Right? This is a heartbeat, 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 heartbeat. And on the bottom is a display of that instantaneous heart rate, showing us how the heart rate is changing all the time. So if your heart were to beat with this interval at all times, this would be your heart rate. If your heart were to beat with this interval at all times, this would be your heart rate. So as the intervals are coming a little bit further apart right here, you can see that those intervals are just a little bit longer than, for example, the intervals here. The heart rate is slowing down with these longer intervals, and the heart rate is speeding up with these shorter intervals. Your heart rate is doing that all the time, increasing and decreasing, increasing and decreasing. That is heart rate variability. Your average heart rate might remain the same, but heart rate variability may be higher or lower. For example, on these two images, this is heart rate variability of a person, of two people, both of them, average heart rate is around 70 beats per minute. The graph on the left, heart rate variability is quite a bit higher. The heart rate varies from about 90 to a high of about 90 to a low of about 70 beats per minute for each breath cycle, for a max-min heart rate variability of 20 beats per minute. On the image on the right, heart rate variability varies only from about 65 to 70 beats per minute for each breath cycle, for a max-min heart rate variability of about 5. So with the same average heart rate variability may be quite a bit higher or lower. The higher someone's heart rate variability, the better off they generally are, the better they're able to respond to stress and challenges in healthy and helpful ways. In our nervous system, heart rate variability reflects the ability of our autonomic nervous system to regulate itself. It tells us how well are we able to reach our peak performance, how well we're able to achieve optimal amount of activation. So on this graph, you see the relationship between our physiological activation and performance, something called the Yorkes-Dodson curve. When our physiological activation is low, when we're quite relaxed, we don't actually perform very well, right? Even though there is a common misconception that we need to be relaxed in order to perform at our best, that is actually not so. If we are very relaxed, we might have trouble paying attention. We might have trouble responding quickly to whatever might be happening in our environment. We may not be able to activate very well. And we need to find that optimal sweet spot of moderate activation in order to be at our best, in order to perform at our best. If we get overactivated, if we drop on the other side of that inverted U, we don't perform so well either. So this curve demonstrates just how important it is for us to find that sweet spot of activation in order for us to be at our best. And heart rate variability indicates just how well are we able to find that sweet spot of activation in order to be at our best, no matter what the situation is, no matter what the challenge is, and how well we're able to recover once the challenge is over. It is our parasympathetic nervous system that helps us achieve this optimal level of activation. The sympathetic nervous system does not really have a built-in shut-off mechanism. It increases its activation, and we need the parasympathetic nervous system to come on and put on the brakes to sympathetic activation in order to allow us to settle at that optimal level of activation, whatever is needed for the challenge in front of us. And as we'll see, it is the parasympathetic nervous system that is responsible for heart rate variability being high, and it's what's responsible for us being able to find that optimal level of activation. Quite a bit of research in the last 4 or 5 decades has shown just how important heart rate variability is for our health and well-being. For example, the Framingham Heart Study, which is perhaps the longest running heart study in the world, has shown that heart rate variability is a better predictor of long-term cardiovascular health than blood pressure, cholesterol levels, and resting heart rate. So high heart rate variability is predictive of better cardiovascular health, whereas low heart rate variability is predictive of potential for high blood pressure or unpleasant cardiovascular events happening 10 years down the road from these measurements, even when the person was entirely healthy at the time the measurements are taken. Heart rate variability is related to our ability to be resilient. It is related to our ability to respond to stress. It's related to our ability to perform at our best. And it is related to our psychophysiological health. Let me expand on that last one. There is a number of psychophysiological conditions where we know that heart rate variability is low, and increasing heart rate variability through biofeedback helps improve the symptoms of these conditions. Conditions like anxiety, chronic pain, depression, diabetes, high blood pressure, irritable bowel syndrome, post-traumatic stress disorder, preeclampsia, traumatic brain injury, migraine are among those conditions where we know those suffering from these conditions have low heart rate variability, and if we help them improve their heart rate variability, their symptoms improve as well. There's a number of influences on heart rate variability, some that are under our control and some less so. We can increase heart rate variability through exercise, a healthier lifestyle, including paying attention to our sleep and nutrition, biofeedback, and mindfulness and self-compassion. And then heart rate variability is decreased by age, poor sleep, chronic stress, and chronic illness. It's important to think about how we measure heart rate variability. If you read any research that involves heart rate variability, you might see references to a number of different ways in which heart rate variability is measured. And that's why I'd like to talk a little bit about measuring HRV, because there are so many different ways of measuring it. It's important to understand what each of these measurements might mean. So if you're reading about it, you'll understand what the author is referring to. There are two main ways to measure heart rate variability. Time domain measures is one, and that just means we're graphing heart rate over time. And then there are several different ways that we can measure heart rate variability within that. I will talk about the three main ones. There are actually several others that, for the sake of time, I'm not going to review right now, but you should know that these are not the only time domain measures. Max-min HRV refers to the change in heart rate within each breath cycle. So the way in the highest heart rate and the lowest heart rate within each cycle. Highest heart rate minus the lowest heart rate is your max-min HRV. So on this top graph, looks like max-min at HRV is about 30, as the highest is 90 beats per minute, the lowest is about 60 for each breath cycle. So this is max-min HRV of about 30, which is quite high. This is a heart rate variability of a very healthy athlete. Now we have SDNN, referring to the standard deviation of normal to normal interval. Normal to normal interval refers to the time that passes from one heartbeat to the next. It's also called RR interval, same thing. For our purposes, it's the same thing. There is a slight nuance there, but as far as understanding this measurement, normal to normal interval and RR interval can be referred to as the same. So with standard deviation of the normal to normal interval, we're taking these time intervals in milliseconds and calculating the standard deviation, telling us how far apart are all these time intervals spread from that middle point. And then the RMSSD, the root mean square of successive differences, is another way to measure the spread, the way in which the heart rate intervals are different from each other, and particularly from intervals next, from adjacent intervals. Another way to measure heart rate variability is through spectral analysis, and this one is a little bit less intuitive. Here, we are taking the heart rate signal, which is composed of a number of different waves of different frequencies, and decomposing that signal into component frequencies that we know where they come from, and we can interpret them in some way. The software uses an algorithm called the fast Fourier transform to decompose your heart rate wave into component frequencies. An easy way to think about it is to think about white light, which is composed of the 7 different color frequencies mixed in together, right? White light is composed of the green and the blue and the purple and the red, right? All those color frequencies mixed in together. And if we take a prism and look at white light through that prism, we'll see the 7 different colors of the rainbow, because the prism will decompose white light into those component frequencies. The software we use for heart rate variability analysis does the same thing to the heart rate signal. It decomposes that signal that is made up of all these different frequencies mixed in together into component frequencies. And there are 3 frequency ranges that we can talk about here, because we know what the input into these frequencies is. We know where the signal comes from, and therefore can tell, we can interpret the signal in a way that tells us something about our autonomic nervous system functioning. So the high frequency signal, which on this graph at the bottom is represented in white, right? So this means that the signal is coming quite fast, right? The oscillations of the signal are coming quite fast. The high frequency signal, the input for it is from the parasympathetic nervous system or the vagal nerve. The very low frequency signal on this graph represented in green, right? So the signal is coming quite a bit slower. The oscillations are quite a bit slower. The input into the very low frequency signal is primarily from the sympathetic nervous system. And then the low frequency signal, represented in orange on this graph, the input for this one is from the baroreflex, or our blood pressure regulation reflex, and the parasympathetic nervous system. So depending on which one of these frequencies is dominant at the time of measurement, we can tell something about the functioning of the autonomic nervous system at the time. There are 2 main sources of heart rate variability. Where does it come from? Why does our heart rate increase and decrease in this way? And there are 2 main sources for it. One is the baroreflex, our homeostatic ability to regulate our blood pressure. There are stretch receptors called the baroreceptors located in our aorta and carotid arteries that are sensitive to stretch. As our arteries, as the blood pressure rises, that puts more pressure on the blood vessels. The baroreceptors detect the greater stretch, send a signal to the medulla oblongata, a part of the brainstem that is responsible for regulating the blood pressure, which then perceives that input and sends a signal to the heart to slow down and reduce the force of contraction, and for the blood vessels to dilate, which then reduces our blood pressure. And as the blood pressure reduces, the stretch on the blood vessels reduces as well. The baroreceptors pick that up and send the signal back to the brain, which then sends a signal to increase the heart rate and constrict the blood vessels, increasing the blood pressure again. So our blood pressure is actually fluctuating in all the time as well, just not nearly as much as the heart rate. We want the heart rate to change as much as possible, but we want the blood pressure to stay fairly stable with small fluctuations. So there is a very concrete relationship between the heart rate and the blood pressure, and this is one of the inputs into heart rate variability. The second source or input into heart rate variability is something called respiratory sinus arrhythmia. And arrhythmia in this case does not mean anything bad. It just means that the heart rate and the breath change together. So as the heart rate As we breathe in, is indicated by this blue wave right here, right? This is as the blue wave goes up, that's an inhalation. So as we breathe in, the heart rate increases. You can see that by the R peaks coming closer together. So it means that as we breathe in, the heart rate increases, and as we breathe out, the heart rate decreases, as indicated by the heartbeats, the R waves coming further apart. So as we breathe in, heart rate goes up. As we breathe out, heart rate goes down. As we breathe in, heart rate goes up. And as we breathe out, heart rate goes down. This is the second major source of heart rate variability and the reason why our heart rate varies as much as it does. Now let's think about heart rate variability, mindfulness, and compassion. What do they all have in common? How can we use them all together? First of all, they're all responsible for self-regulation. They're responsible for our ability to respond to changes in our internal and external environment in a helpful and healthy way. The parasympathetic nervous system is a major source of heart rate variability, and it also underlies mindfulness and compassion. So the foundational source for all three of these concepts is the same: parasympathetic nervous system, including the vagal nerve. Heart rate variability can be used as a biomarker for measuring mindfulness and compassion. And furthermore, HRV training, a way to increase heart rate variability, can be used to complement mindfulness and compassion training as well. So let's talk more about this relationship between heart rate variability and mindfulness first. For example, heart rate variability and mindfulness amplify each other's effects on well-being, as this one study, as a recent study has shown. Separately in this study, both heart rate variability and mindfulness were related to lower emotional exhaustion and greater relaxation in healthcare workers. But together, their effect was amplified. So there was an interaction effect such that the emotional exhaustion was lowest and relaxation was highest when both heart rate variability and mindfulness were high. So heart rate variability by itself makes a difference and helps people feel better. Mindfulness in itself makes a difference and is related to people's well-being. But when you bring the two together, people do the best. Heart rate variability is also a very common marker for mindfulness. And in this particular study, heart rate variability was found to be a biomarker for treatment response for mindfulness-based interventions. In the study that was comparing mindfulness-based interventions and fluoxetine in treating generalized anxiety disorder, there was a subgroup of patients for whom the mindfulness-based interventions was actually less effective, and the researchers were able to identify that group of patients through measuring their pre-treatment heart rate variability. Finally, heart rate variability is an objective way to show the effectiveness of these mindfulness-based interventions. Numerous studies have used HRV to quantify the effectiveness of MBIs. And one recent review study determined that heart rate variability is an objective biomarker that we can effectively use to quantify effects of mindfulness-based interventions. Now let's talk about heart rate variability and compassion. Research shows that higher heart rate variability is associated with greater connectivity between the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and areas of the brain that are also strongly connected with the experience of compassion. So areas of the brain such as the insula, the anterior cingulate cortex, the middle cingulate cortex, and the amygdala. So there is a direct relationship in the brain between higher heart rate variability and the areas of the brain that are responsible for our experience of compassion. As our heart variability increases, the activity in these, the connectivity with these brain areas is increased. There's a number of other studies showing a strong connection between heart rate variability and compassion. For example, a recent meta-analysis showed strong association between heart rate variability and compassion with medium effect sizes. Another study showed that increased heart rate variability is associated with higher likelihood of compassionate action. Right? That's pretty important. Not only do we want to feel compassion, but we also want to act on it. And those with higher heart rate variability are more likely to engage in compassionate action. Higher heart rate variability at baseline is associated with both state and trait compassion. So it's associated with just our baseline compassion as well as compassion that happens in certain states. Finally, we also know that compassion-focused practices tend to improve heart rate variability. However, the relationship between heart rate variability and compassion is not entirely straightforward. There are some important nuances that we should keep in mind when thinking about HRV and compassion. For example, one study showed that self-compassion is associated with higher HRV reactivity. That means that self-compassion is associated with heart rate variability becoming smaller or bigger depending on what the person was engaged in. So in this study, participants were asked to write in a self-critical manner, right? So they were writing about something about themselves and criticizing their qualities and mimicking the way that we often judge ourselves harshly when we're having a hard time. So during this task, self-criticism was associated with lower heart rate variability at the time of writing, which makes sense because being self-critical is stressful, right? So that means that those participants were actually engaging with the task. Their heart rate variability became lower as they were more stressed. And then their heart rate variability became higher when they were recovering from that task. So when they were able to let go of self-criticism, their heart rate variability increased. And what's interesting is this increase in heart rate variability only happened for those who also increased their self-compassion during the 6-week self-compassion training. So this is really important. Increase in heart rate variability only happened for those who also increased their self-compassion and who were able to engage better with the self-critical task and then recover better from it. Now, this idea of compassionate action, right? Not only do we want to experience compassion, but it's really important to act on it as well. So we know that greater attention and sensitivity to others' suffering is associated with lower heart rate variability. Why is that? Because we are attending to another person's suffering, and that affects our nervous system. That's stressful. That lowers our heart rate variability, and that is okay, because then when we're able to act in compassionate ways, that is associated with higher heart rate variability. So if we just attending to other people's suffering, we might be taking on some of that suffering that is stressful, that reduces our ability to self-regulate in that moment. But when we act in compassionate ways, that actually improves our ability to self-regulate. It improves our heart rate variability. Another very interesting study showed an interaction between heart rate variability and self-compassion training for pain. In this situation, this was experimentally induced pain where the participants were asked to hold a very cold glass or bottle, with ice, and they experienced, moderate amounts of pain. The researchers measured participants' trait, self-compassion, and resting or baseline heart rate variability. And they found that self-compassion was associated with lower pain only when heart rate variability was high. And interestingly, self-compassion was actually associated with higher pain when heart rate variability was low. So what does this mean? It might mean that people whose heart rate variability is low, meaning that they're having trouble regulating their emotional and physiological activation, actually have a hard time with self-compassion. And they experience higher pain when attempting to be self-compassionate because they're actually having a hard time regulating their nervous system enough to experience self-compassion. But when someone's heart rate variability is higher, they're able to regulate better, they're able to respond to their environment in a healthier way, are able to make better use of self-compassion practices. And self-compassion is associated with lower pain for them. So perhaps increasing heart rate variability might make it easier for people to make use of things like self-compassion training. And this is something that we need to continue looking at in research. So having looked at the connection between heart rate variability, mindfulness, and self-compassion, let's think about how we might integrate heart rate variability into mindfulness and self-compassion practices. First of all, heart rate variability serves as a biomarker for compassion and mindfulness. We can use heart rate variability monitoring to establish a baseline so that we know where we're starting off. Let's say prior to participating in a mindfulness course or a compassion or a self-compassion course, we can take several days of our heart rate variability readings so we know where we are, so that we can monitor our progress as we go through the mindfulness or the self-compassion course, and we can see where we end up at the end. We can use heart rate variability measurements to tell us how well we are learning, how well is our body responding to mindfulness and self-compassion practices. We can assess and train the capacity to engage in mindfulness and compassion-based interventions. Right? That study that identified a subgroup of patients who had trouble with mindfulness-based interventions. We can identify folks early on who might have trouble with mindfulness or self-compassion practices, and we might initially help them raise their heart rate variability before engaging in mindfulness and self-compassion courses or practices in order to actually help them make the best use of that training. Finally, heart rate variability is data. It tells us exactly what's going on with our nervous system. And this data-driven approach may often increase the appeal of mindfulness and self-compassion based interventions for perhaps the more skeptical folks, for those who say, show me, tell me whether this is actually going to work for me. And being able to use that reliable measurement of physiological functioning can be a really good way to engage people who might otherwise hesitate to engage in mindfulness or compassion-based practices. We can also use heart rate variability biofeedback to train our heart rate variability to increase. So what is biofeedback? Biofeedback is a way for us to actually see what our heart rate variability is doing in real time, right? We can, as you see on this, on the side of the slide, we can see what's happening with our heart rate in real time. It tells us how our heart rate is changing with each breath. So we can track how our heart rate variability is changing, and we can see how our breathing practices, which is what we can do to increase heart rate variability, actually works to increase HRV in real time. We know that heart rate variability biofeedback is effective in increasing baseline HRV over time, and we can use this to facilitate mindfulness and self-compassion training. HRV biofeedback is done through breath training. Breathing is also something we attend to a lot in mindfulness and self-compassion. The attention to the breath is a little bit different in HRV, but can very easily be done in mindful and compassionate ways. Heart rate variability training is done through something called resonance frequency breathing. Resonance is a physics concept that describes the property of an oscillating system in which two components of that oscillating system interplay with each other, producing maximum oscillations of one of them. So as stimulations from one part of the system produce maximum oscillations in the other. An easy way to think about it is to compare this system to pushing a child on a swing. So a person is one part of the system, the child on the swing is the other part of the system, and there are numerous ways in which you might be able to push the swing. You can push the swing once with a lot of force, and it will go up, but not very evenly, will come right back down, or you can push the swing with short, frequent bursts, and the swing is going to go up just a little bit and come right back down. And in both of these scenarios, the child is not going to be very happy. But you can find a way to push the swing in measured, regular, even ways so that each time you push, the swing goes up as much as possible and comes down as much as possible, and goes up as much as possible and comes down as much as possible, maximizing the delight of the child. Your breath stimulates the heart rate in the same way as the person pushing the swing. As you breathe in, your heart rate goes up. As you breathe out, your heart rate goes down. And we can find an optimal way of breathing that will maximize the way in which your heart rate goes up on each inhalation and the way in which your heart rate goes down on each exhalation. So on the right part of your slide, you see the way in which your heart rate might change as a result of resonance frequency breathing. The red signal is your heart rate at rest, going up and down a bit. But as you add heart rate variability biofeedback, as you add that resonance frequency breathing, your heart rate starts going up a lot more and coming down a lot more. And that is what we're looking for. As we breathe at our resonance frequency breathing, we increase the heart rate as much as possible on the inhalation, decrease it as much as possible on the exhalation. And during that time, we train our nervous system to increase its resilience, to increase our ability to respond to stress and challenges in healthy ways. And over time, that ability to respond to stress and challenges in healthy ways improves. And each time we practice resonance frequency breathing, we build that ability to respond, and we train our nervous system to respond in healthy ways. You might wonder, well, how does heart rate variability enhance meditation? As we talked about, it amplifies the effectiveness of mindfulness and self-compassion practices. Because heart rate variability training improves our physiological ability to self-regulate, it can decrease physiological arousal at the time of distress. It improves our self-regulation and therefore reduces the intensity of suffering without a struggle. So it makes it easier to accept experiences that may otherwise be fundamentally unacceptable, such as, for example, experience of panic. We can use heart rate variability training to reduce the intensity of suffering and enabling people to become mindful and compassionate during experience of severe anxiety or panic. Allows people to stop pushing away from intense suffering. HRV biofeedback also increases body awareness, facilitates connections between physiological and emotional states, and provides real-time feedback on the effects of meditation. Many people wonder, and some of you might be thinking, well, how does biofeedback and mindfulness work together? They seem to be the complete opposites of each other. So, biofeedback is all about action, and mindfulness is all about allowing things to be and letting go. How can these two possibly work together? And the parable of the lute, the story of the middle way, gives us a great metaphor for just how biofeedback and mindfulness work together. So the parable of the lute tells a story of Sona, the son of a businessman in ancient India, who wanted to find enlightenment. So he went off and he meditated, and he worked really hard to reach enlightenment, and he couldn't get there. So he sought out the Buddha, and he asked the Buddha, help me, help me get there, because what I'm doing is not quite working. And the Buddha knew that Sona was a skilled lute player. So he said, tell me, Sona, when the strings of your lute are tuned very tightly, can you play it well? No, I can't. It doesn't sound very good. And if the strings of the lute are tuned very loosely, can you play it well then? No, that doesn't work very well either. It doesn't sound good. Okay, how about if the strings of the lute are tuned just right? Can you play it well then? Yes, then I can. Then my lute sounds beautiful. Well, there you go, Sona. Here's that middle way between goal-directed action and letting go. You need to find that balance just right. Tuning the strings of the lute, not too tight, not too loose. And that's exactly what biofeedback allows us to do. It's the middle way between goal-directed action, which is biofeedback, and letting go, which is mindfulness. Combining the two together helps us find the middle way, helps us find an optimal state of activation, helps us find an optimal way of responding to stress and challenges. So if you were to integrate heart rate variability, training, mindfulness, and self-compassion, you might begin your meditation practice with some HRV breathing at resonance frequency rate. You may come back to your resonance frequency breathing as an anchor when your attention wanders off during meditation practice. And you might adopt compassionate attitude during your practice. We're all human, we all make mistakes, no one's perfect. Sometimes our minds wander off, sometimes we can't quite find our optimal breathing rate, and all of that is okay. Being kind to ourselves, both in the content and the tone of our self-talk. So to finish, let's try this together. We're going to use low and slow breathing that in a moment I'm going to pace you at 6 breaths per minute, which is the rate of breathing that gets close enough to resonance frequency breathing for most people. Resonance frequency breathing is typically somewhere between 4 and 7 breaths per minute. And each person has their own. But since we can't determine each of your resonance frequencies right now, I will pace you at 6 breaths per minute, which will get close enough for most of you. And we'll use low and slow breathing, where I'm going to ask you to shift your breath to the belly. Inhale slowly, slowing down your rate of breathing, inhaling as if you are smelling a flower, and then exhaling slowly through the nose or through pursed lips, as if you're blowing out a candle, like this. And there is no need for a particularly big or deep breath, just normal. Let's do this together. Breathing in and out. In and out. And I will now pace your breathing. As the purple ball goes up, you're going to breathe in. And as the purple ball goes down, you're going to breathe out. In. Out. Continue breathing, perhaps following the pacer, or just doing the best you can to continue breathing at this rate. And I will guide you through a meditation practice for a very shortened version of how you might do this to combine HRV, biofeedback training, and mindfulness and self-compassion. So I'm going to ask you to think about a difficult person in your life who you would like to help, but who also is kind of hard, and who may be hard to help. And as you bring that person in mind, continue breathing in that low and slow, measured way. Repeating silently after me. Everyone is on his or her own life journey. I am not the cause of this person's suffering. Nor is it entirely within my power to make it go away, even if I wish I could. Moments like this are difficult to bear. Yet I may still try to help if I can. And taking another low and slow breath in and out. Coming back. Thank you very much. I will now take questions.
네. 네, 이나 카잔 교수님 좋은 발표 잘 들었습니다. 이나 카잔 교수님께서는 심박 간격의 변화를 나타내는 심박변이도와 마음챙김 그리고 연민에 대한 그런 강연을 해주셨습니다. 지금부터 한 15분 정도의 시간 동안 질의응답 시간을 갖도록 하겠습니다. 앞서 말씀드렸듯이 사전 질문들이 아주 좋은 질문들이 많이 저희들한테 들어와 있는데요. 그 중에 한두 가지만 우선 이나 카잔 교수님께 한번 올려보겠습니다. 첫 번째, HRV 호흡 훈련과 불교의 전통적 호흡 명상과 기술적 측면에서 어떤 관련이 있을지 궁금하다는 질문입니다. 답변 부탁드립니다.
HRV breathing training is a way in which we mindfully where we produce mindful change to our breath. And the idea is to allow the breath to follow this resonance frequency breathing rate without struggling, without controlling the breath. The idea is, this is not, a breath control practice. The idea is to allow the breath to follow this gentle, rise and fall, following the pacer, allowing yourself to fall into the resonance frequency breathing rate, mindfully observing what that breath feels like. Noticing what the inhalation feels like, noticing what the exhalation feels like, where you feel the inhalation, where you feel the exhalation. And the idea is to learn how the body responds, to that rate of breathing, so that eventually you don't need the pacer, so that you can enter the resonance frequency breathing rate without having to rely on any external methods, but rather letting your breath fall into that breath on your own mindfully, and utilizing the same principles of mindful breathing practice that you would in a traditional breath meditation.
네, 감사합니다. 두 번째 질문인데요. 두 번째도 우리 이전에 질문해 주신 내용을 추려봤습니다. 명상을 수행하는 초보자와 숙련자 간의 심박 변이도에는 차이점이 없는가요? 있다면 그 양상으로 어떤 결론을 도출할 수 있을까요? 이런 질문이 들어와 있습니다.
People who are experienced meditators will have an easier time falling into their resonance frequency breathing rate without a struggle, because they already have so much experience attending to the breath without a struggle. So falling into that resonance frequency pace is typically easier for them, but certainly novice meditators, will, with a little bit of practice, will be able to achieve that as well. And there is some research showing that experienced meditators have higher heart rate variability than novice meditators. But that research is actually not entirely consistent. And the reason for it might have something to do with the rate of breathing. In traditional meditation, we don't necessarily reduce the rate of breathing, right? And in order to increase heart rate variability, that reduction in the breathing rate seems to be quite important. So the research is not entirely consistent, and we need to look more into what underlies the increases in HRV for some long-term meditators, but perhaps not others.
네, 감사합니다. 그러면 지금 현장에서 혹시 지금 질문하실 분 계신가요? 지금 현장 질문도 받을 수 있을 것 같습니다. 줌을 통해서 지금 질문, 마이크 좀 준비 좀 해줄 수 있나요? 줌을 통해서만 지금 질문 가능한 거죠? 지금 줌으로 질문 들어왔답니다. 현장 질문으로 제가 한 가지만 또 드리겠습니다. 일상에서 쓸 수 있는 명상 방법 중에서 심박 변이도, 자비, 마음 챙김과 관련해 구체적으로 실천해 볼 수 있는 것이 있을까요? 이런 질문이 들어와 있습니다.
I'm sorry, I can't hear the translation.
Wait a minute. It's
I can hear you now.
I think you were on
repeat
mute.
the question.
Go on. Yeah.
My suggestion is to use any meditation practice that that you enjoy, but perhaps started with doing some heart rate variability breathing first. I do recommend learning to breathe at your resonance frequency first, just in a mindful way, so that you're not struggling with that breath, and then bringing that practice into your meditation practice, whatever meditation you enjoy. Let's say, it might be the metta, the self-compassion practice, which is a wonderful addition to your everyday life. You might start it with doing 5 minutes of resonance frequency breathing. Then, while staying, in that breathing state, practicing the metta. You can do the same thing with a breath meditation. You might allow your breathing to fall into your resonance frequency breathing rate, stay there for 5 minutes, and then let go of the focus on the particular rate, and just attend to the sensations of the breath. But the nice thing is you can really combine this with any kind of meditation that you enjoy.